Welcome to the Mystery and Horror channel. Get ready for dark stories that will give you chills. Before we start, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to stay tuned for every new mystery. Now turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let's dive into terror. Story 1. The Guest Room Mirror. My grandparents had an old house in the countryside, where we spent most of our summer vacations. The house was spacious, with a decor filled with antique objects and dark wooden furniture. One of the guest rooms had a peculiar feature. A large mirror with a heavy frame hung on the wall beside the bed. The frame had intricate carvings, with faces that seemed sculpted from the very wood, but they were strange faces, with distorted and frightening expressions, almost as if they were watching anyone who passed by. Since I was young, I avoided entering that room because I always felt a strange presence when I looked at the mirror. However, during one visit, the house was full, and my mother decided that I would have to sleep there alone. Despite my discomfort, I tried to accept it, thinking it would be just one night. When I turned off the light and lay down, I felt the atmosphere change. The surrounding darkness felt dense, and even with my eyes closed, I sensed that something was watching me. I opened my eyes and looked at the mirror. The faint light from the window seemed to reflect in a strange way, casting shadows that danced across the glass surface. My heart raced, but I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Then I noticed something odd in the reflection. Although the room was empty, I saw a shadow in the background, something that appeared to be behind me. I swallowed hard and slowly turned, but when I looked directly, I saw nothing. I sighed, trying to calm myself, but when I looked back at the mirror, the shadow was still there, motionless, and it seemed to be getting closer little by little. I froze, feeling fear take over. I wanted to run, scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. I kept watching, trapped in my own terror, as the shadow began to transform into a figure with human contours, deep eyes, and a grotesque smile. The image was so vivid that I felt hypnotized, unable to look away. Suddenly, the mirror made a low sound like a muffled groan, and the figure started to lean toward me. At that moment, I regained control and got up quickly, running out of the room and straight to my grandparents' bedroom. I knocked on the door and, between sobs, told them what had happened. My grandparents tried to calm me, saying I'd had a nightmare, but I knew what I had seen. The next morning, I went to the room with my mother. The mirror was there, in the same place, but now it seemed harmless, just a decorative object. However, I was never able to look at it the same way again. I avoided that room for the rest of the summers we spent there, and even today when I close my eyes, I can still see that shadowy figure approaching me through the mirror, as if waiting for another chance to reveal itself. Story 2. The Door in the Attic. When my parents bought our new house, I quickly noticed that it had an old attic accessible by a folding ladder in the hallway. They rarely went up there, using the space only to store boxes of things they no longer used. I always found the attic intriguing, but my parents forbade me from going up, saying it was dangerous. Maybe that's what fueled my curiosity and desire to discover what was hidden up there. One day, while my parents were out, I decided it was time to investigate. I took the attic key kept in the kitchen, pulled down the ladder, and climbed up, trying to ignore the smell of dust and the cold air coming from above. As soon as I reached the top, a chill ran down my spine. The space was dark and damp, with boxes and furniture covered in white sheets scattered in the corners, creating eerie silhouettes. Exploring the place, I noticed a tiny door at the far end, something I hadn't expected to find. It was so small it almost went unnoticed, with old worn wood and a rusty doorknob. Curiosity got the best of me, and ignoring the fear that was starting to creep in, I turned the doorknob and pushed the door, which creaked ominously as it opened. On the other side, there was a small empty room with concrete walls and a wooden chair in the center, facing the wall. The air was dense and cold, and the feeling of being watched intensified. It was an oppressive silence, as if time were frozen in that place. Approaching cautiously, I observed the chair and felt an irresistible urge to sit, as if something inside the room were calling to me. Slowly, I sat in the chair and looked around. Then I heard a faint whisper, almost imperceptible, like someone speaking very close to my ear. It was a hoarse voice, repeating words I couldn't understand. Panic began to set in, and with my heart racing, I tried to get up, but it seemed as if the chair held me down. The whisper grew louder, and the sensation of invisible hands pressing on my shoulders became increasingly real. With a desperate effort, I finally managed to get up and ran out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. I descended the attic stairs and put the key back, trying to catch my breath and convince myself it had all been an illusion. But the fear I felt was too real to be just imagination. I never told my parents what happened, but since that day I avoided the attic at all costs. Sometimes I still hear that whisper in my dreams, as if the voice were calling me back, drawing me to that tiny room, to that chair, which seems to hold an ancient and dark secret that perhaps I should never have discovered. Story 3: The Child on the Swing. During my childhood, there was a park in the town where I used to play with my friends. The park was simple, with swings, a slide, and a sandbox. However, there was something peculiar that everyone avoided. A specific swing, set further apart from the others, that always remained still, as if it hadn't been used in years. No one knew for sure why that swing was isolated, but everyone was afraid to approach it. One summer afternoon, while my friends and I were playing hide and seek, I ended up near the abandoned swing. It was getting dark, and the shadow of the swing seemed longer and denser, as if something invisible were sitting there, waiting. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I ignored it, telling myself it was just the wind. Then I heard a slight creak, the familiar sound of a swing moving slowly. I looked around, but no one was there. The swing began to move, swinging back and forth with no explanation. I felt a wave of fear and thought of running, but before I could, I heard a low, childlike laugh. It seemed to come from the swing itself, but there was no one there. I felt my body freeze as the swing continued to move, and the laughter turned into a whisper. It was a child's voice, almost like a lament, and it seemed to be saying something like, "Come play with me." Finally, I managed to move and ran back to my friends, telling them what had happened. They laughed and said I was just making up stories to scare them, but the fear I felt was real. In the weeks that followed, I avoided the park, but the memory of that laugh and the swing moving by itself continued to haunt me. Months later, I overheard my parents talking about a tragedy that had occurred years before in the park. A child had disappeared while playing on that same swing and was never found. They said that since then, the swing had remained empty, like a dark memorial for what had happened. The story sent chills down my spine, but also confirmed what I already knew. There was something very wrong with that swing. Today, every time I pass by the park, I feel a shiver and quicken my pace. The swing is still there, motionless during the day, but on the quietest nights, I swear I can hear the sound of it moving, accompanied by a low laugh that echoes in the wind, like a distant call from someone who never stopped waiting for company. Story 4: The House on the Hill. When I was a child, there was an old house at the top of a hill, far from the town. It was an abandoned building with broken windows and faded walls that seemed on the verge of collapse. They said that decades before, a family had lived there, but something terrible happened, and they all disappeared without a trace. The house became known as the House of the Missing, and no one dared to go near it. One day, in a fit of courage, my friends and I decided to explore the house. We climbed the hill, laughing and trying to hide the fear we all felt. The front door was ajar, creaking in the wind, and as we pushed it open, the sound echoed through the empty house. The air inside was cold and dense, with a strong smell of mold and something else like rusty iron. We entered slowly, observing the dust-covered furniture, the cracked walls, and the creaky floor beneath our feet. As we walked through the living room, I noticed an old frame hanging on the wall. The photo showed a family, father, mother, and 2 children. Their gazes were empty and their faces seemed worn by time, but there was a strange smile on the mother's lips, something that gave me an immediate chill. As we continued exploring, we heard a faint whisper coming from upstairs. We looked at each other, scared, but decided to go up. The staircase creaked beneath our feet, and each step seemed to bring us closer to something dark, something we might never want to find. When we reached the 2nd floor, the whisper stopped, leaving an almost deafening silence. We explored the rooms, which were empty except for some old furniture. In the last room, we found a rocking chair facing the window. The chair began to move on its own, a slow and steady rocking, as if an invisible presence were seated there. We were paralyzed until the chair suddenly stopped and a cold, intense chill filled the room. Then we heard heavy footsteps in the hallway. The sound was clear and firm, coming toward us, but when we turned, no one was there. Panic set in and we ran down the stairs, stumbling over each other in our attempt to escape. When we finally got out of the house, we turned to look back. On the second floor, in the window of the last room, we saw an indistinct figure watching us. It was just a shadow, but it seemed to follow us with its gaze as if marked by our presence. Since that day, none of us returned to the hill. The house is still there, empty and forgotten, but sometimes on the quietest nights, they say you can hear the sound of the rocking chair, moving by itself as if it's waiting for the next visitor. Story 5. The Voice in the Well. When I was a child, my grandmother lived in an old house by the edge of a field, and in the backyard there was a very old well. It was one of those wells made of irregular stones, covered by a wooden lid worn down by time. My grandmother always told me not to go near it, warning that the well was dangerous and had been sealed for a reason she never wanted to explain. One cold, silent night during one of my visits, I woke up with an unbearable thirst. Instead of getting water from the kitchen, I decided to go out to the backyard. The house was completely quiet, and the cold floor under my feet only intensified the chill I felt as I walked alone in the dark. When I reached the backyard, something made me stop next to the well. It was so dark I couldn't see anything inside, but the silence around me was almost tangible. That's when I heard it. A low sound, almost like a murmur, coming from the bottom of the well. It was a faint, dragging voice, as if someone were trying to speak but with extreme difficulty. I froze, listening as the sound grew louder, a hoarse voice that seemed to repeat a word or a name, though I couldn't understand what it was saying. Curious and frightened, I leaned over to look inside the well, but the darkness was so dense it seemed like a solid wall. Feeling drawn in by that voice, I started to lean further and further, almost as if something inside me was being pulled downward. The sound of the voice became clearer, and in a pleading tone, it seemed to beg for help, as if someone were trapped at the bottom, calling for rescue. Suddenly, I felt a hand grip my shoulder, pulling me back. It was my grandmother, looking at me with a serious, worried expression. She led me back inside without saying a word, quickly closing all doors and windows. The next morning, I tried to tell her about what I had heard, but she refused to answer and simply asked me never to approach the well again. In the years that followed, whenever I visited my grandmother's house, I avoided the backyard, but the curiosity and fear never left me. Once, as an adult, I asked her what was really in that well, and she only murmured, with a distant look, that the well held ancient secrets, voices that came from far beyond our understanding. She said it was a gateway to something that should be forgotten, something no one should dare to summon. Since then, every time I remember that whisper, I feel the same chill, and I wonder what would have happened if I had leaned in just a little more. Whether that voice was really asking for help, or if, somehow, it wanted me to come down and never return. Story 6. The Forbidden Room. My uncles had an old house that served as a summer retreat for the whole family. It was a large house with more than 20 rooms, some of which hadn't been used in years. One of those rooms was known as the Forbidden Room. No one was allowed to enter, and my uncles always said it was just because it was in poor condition with a compromised ceiling and floor. But even as a child, I noticed they avoided going near that door, and it always made me suspicious. One holiday, curiosity got the better of me. I took advantage of everyone being busy sunbathing in the garden and went to explore the Forbidden Room. The door was locked, but after some effort, I managed to turn the knob. The room was dusty, with furniture covered in white sheets that looked like motionless ghosts, and the air was cold and heavy as if time had stopped inside. As soon as I entered, a chill ran through me. It was as if something was watching me, a presence hiding in the shadows. I walked slowly through the room, trying to ignore the growing fear, until I saw, in the far corner, a mirror. It was an old mirror with a dark, cracked frame, as if someone had tried to shatter it in vain. I approached it, inexplicably drawn, and looked at my reflection. But instead of just seeing my own face, I saw a figure behind me, a tall, immobile shadow that didn't move even when I turned around. I tried not to panic and look back at the mirror, but the figure was still there, and its eyes seemed to glow, two red points in the darkness. With my heart racing, I ran out of the room, locking the door behind me. When I told my uncles, they looked at me with worry and said nothing. Since then, I never tried to open that door again, and to this day, I feel a chill whenever I remember those eyes in the mirror, holding a dark secret I was never meant to see. Story 7. The Music in the Cemetery. My town had a small cemetery, set away from the houses and surrounded by old trees that kept the place always shady and damp. Even during the day, the atmosphere was dense and covered by a light mist that never seemed to lift. At night, the cemetery took on an even more sinister aura. I always avoided walking by, but one night, after a party that ended late, I decided to take a shortcut through the cemetery to get home faster. It was a cold night, with a thin moon in the sky and faint stars peeking through the clouds. I walked quickly, trying to ignore the absolute silence around me. It was so quiet I could hear the sound of my steps on the wet grass. That's when, halfway through, I heard something that made me freeze. It was soft music, almost like the melody of a music box, echoing through the empty cemetery. I stood still, trying to understand where the sound was coming from. I looked around but saw no one. The music continued, slow and captivating, with a cadence that seemed to increase and decrease in intensity. Against my better judgment, I started following the melody, inexplicably drawn to it. The closer I got, the clearer the sound became, but I still couldn't see where it was coming from. The melody seemed to come from all directions, surrounding me as if floating in the air. Walking between the old headstones, I realized I was approaching a specific grave. The headstone was worn, covered in moss, and the name engraved on it was almost illegible, but I could make out that it belonged to a young woman. A chill ran through me, and the music seemed to come directly from that grave. When I leaned in for a closer look, the melody intensified, and for a brief moment, I heard a soft voice, almost whispering, that seemed to sing along with the melody, a sad, hypnotic chant. Suddenly, an intense cold enveloped the area, and the air grew heavy. I tried to back away, but my feet felt glued to the ground, as if something invisible was holding me there. The voice, once soft, grew shrill, almost a scream, as if it were trying to tell me something. I felt panic seize me, and with a huge effort, I managed to take a few steps back, breaking free from the feeling of paralysis. I ran as fast as I could without looking back, listening to the melody fade away slowly. When I finally left the cemetery, I looked back and everything was silent, but the chill lingered. In the nights that followed, the melody continued to play in my head, like an echo I couldn't erase. To this day, I avoid passing by the cemetery, but I still wonder if that music was a lament from someone who never found peace. Story 8. The Porcelain Doll. When I was 8, my great-aunt gave me a porcelain doll that had belonged to our family for generations. It was a delicate piece, with an old lace dress, curly hair, and glass eyes that always seemed to follow me, no matter where I was in the room. I didn't like her much, but my great-aunt said it was a family heirloom and that I should take good care of her because the doll brought protection. For the first few days, I kept the doll on a high shelf where I could barely see her and didn't think much of it. But over time, strange things started happening. Every morning when I woke up, I found the doll in a different position, as if someone had moved her during the night. I'd leave her facing the wall, but somehow, I always found her facing me, with those fixed eyes and a slight smile on her face. At first, I thought it was my mom playing a prank on me, but when I asked her, she said she never touched the doll. The unease grew, but I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. One night, however, I woke up with a strange feeling of discomfort and looked toward the shelf. The doll was there, but she seemed closer, as if she had moved a little. I knew it was impossible, but the feeling was frighteningly real. That same night, while trying to go back to sleep, I felt something gently touch my arm. I woke up with a start, and to my surprise, the doll was on the bed beside me, her glass eyes glinting slightly in the darkness. I froze, unable to understand how she had gotten off the shelf and onto the bed. The fear was so intense I could hardly breathe, and I stayed that way until dawn, staring at her, unable to sleep. The next day I told my mom, who laughed and said I probably had a nightmare. But I knew that wasn't a dream. I decided to lock the doll in a box and store it in the back of the closet, but even then I still felt her presence. Some nights, I could hear faint whispers coming from the closet, as if someone were calling my name softly. It was a muffled sound, almost inaudible, but disturbing enough to keep me awake. Finally, I asked my mom if I could take the doll back to my great-aunt's house, and she agreed. When I arrived, I left the doll on a shelf in the room and said goodbye without looking back. Since then, I've never seen her again, but to this day, I feel like something of her glassy gaze stayed with me. On the rare occasions I visit my great-aunt, I see the doll still on the shelf, with that same enigmatic smile, as if she's patiently waiting for the next person she'll choose. Story 9. The Mysterious Neighbor. When I moved to a new neighborhood, I was excited to start a new life. The house was cozy and the area was quiet. However, from the beginning, I noticed something strange about the house next door. It was an old building with large windows and heavy curtains that were always closed. I never saw anyone coming or going, and over time, I began to wonder if the house was really inhabited. For the first few weeks, I ignored the mystery of the house next door, thinking I'd eventually see some movement. However, it soon became impossible to ignore. One night, as I looked out the window, I saw a light briefly turn on the second floor of the neighboring house. Curiously, I kept watching, but the light soon went out. In the following days, I noticed that the light came on at the same time every night, staying on for a few minutes before disappearing. It was as if someone was there but never left during the day. My curiosity grew, and I decided to investigate more closely. One night, I went to the yard of the house and tried to peek through the window, but the glass was so dirty and fogged up that I could only make out indistinct shadows. That's when I heard a faint sound like a muffled whisper coming from inside. The sound grew louder, and soon I could make out repeated words, almost like a prayer or perhaps a murmur of agony. My skin prickled and I backed away, feeling I shouldn't be there. That same night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my house. I quickly got up and went to the window, peering out at the sidewalk. There stood a figure staring at me. It was tall and thin, but the darkness obscured its face. When I tried to focus to see who it was, the figure disappeared without a sound, as if it had never been there. In the following days, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, and the presence felt more intense, closer. Every night, at the same time, the light in the neighbor's house would turn on, and I knew that, from the other side, something was watching me in return. One day, I talked to an elderly woman from the neighborhood and asked about the house. She looked at me with a somber expression and said no one had lived there for years, since the previous owner mysteriously disappeared without a trace. She also said that, since then, some residents had reported seeing the light turn on by itself and feeling a presence nearby. The story shook me, but it confirmed what I already feared. Since then, I've avoided looking at the house at night. I know the light still turns on every day, and even with the curtains closed, I feel something on the other side continues to watch me, as if waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Story 10. The Ring in the Lake. During a family trip, we camped near a lake in an isolated, peaceful area. It was a beautiful place, surrounded by tall trees that blocked the wind and left the area strangely quiet. However, from the moment we arrived, I sensed something dark about that lake, something hidden beneath its calm surface. I tried to ignore the feeling, thinking it was just my imagination, but something inside me was unsettled. On the first night, as I walked along the shore, I saw something shining in the mud near the water. I crouched to look closer and found a ring buried almost completely in the dirt. It was a silver ring, simple, with a black stone in the center that seemed to absorb all the light around it. For some inexplicable reason, I felt an immediate attraction to it, and without a second thought, I washed the ring in the water and slipped it on my finger. There was something comforting, almost hypnotic, about the ring, as if it had been made for me. That same night, I had a strange and disturbing dream. In it, I was standing on the edge of the lake, staring into the dark waters, when a pale figure slowly emerged from the depths. It was a woman with empty eyes and an expression of intense sadness. Her arms were outstretched as if she wanted me to come closer, and her lips murmured something I couldn't understand. I woke up in a cold sweat, heart racing, with a feeling of dread that wouldn't go away. In the days that followed, I continued wearing the ring, but the discomfort only grew. Whenever I passed by the lake, I felt an intense chill, and it seemed like someone was watching me from the shadows of the trees. At night, the dream of the woman in the lake repeated, but each time she seemed closer. Her empty gaze was terrifying, and in the last dream, she even extended her hands toward me, as if she wanted to pull me into the water. Finally, on a moonless night, I decided to get rid of the ring. I waited until everyone was asleep, then went to the edge of the lake. The water was so still it looked like a dark mirror, reflecting only the silhouettes of the surrounding trees. With my heart pounding, I took the ring off my finger and threw it into the water with all my might. The sound of the ring hitting the water was muffled, followed by a profound silence, as if the lake itself held its breath for a moment. The instant the ring sank, the feeling of weight vanished. It was as if something had been released, something that would no longer follow me. I returned to the tent and slept deeply for the first time since finding the ring. The next morning, the lake looked as calm as ever, but somewhere in its depths, I knew the ring remained, along with the restless spirit that had visited my dreams. Since then, I haven't had nightmares about the woman in the lake, but every time I think of that place, I feel as though something was left behind, a presence still lurking, waiting for someone else who might find it again. If you made it this far, the mystery has hooked you. So, leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to follow each new story. Thanks for watching and see you in the next terror.